Okay, hello, everyone. I'm sitting in the UUCD Social Hall, which is why I'm masked this morning. A little unusual. Anyway, welcome to the forum. This is presented by your Climate Action Team, which has been in existence for 7 years now. And we have engaged in a variety of practical, educational, and advocacy kinds of action over those years. Today, we're going to talk about, we're going from the macro to the local here, and all the way down to the individual, actually, when we do some talking about how we may talk about climate. But we're going to start out by looking at the news that came out of Glasgow, which is called COP26. And many of you have read in the news about it. It had, and Russ will go over it, had both the formal, difficult UN negotiations among 180 some countries, and lots of activity outside those formal negotiations. And he's going to give you some news about what kind of agreements were reached. And then we'll hear about what's happening nationally in Congress primarily from Sally. And then I'm going to talk a bit about UUCD, and Brett is going to talk about some other things in the city of Duluth and get us into breakout rooms so we can do some talking about how we talk about climate with others. So we're going to start right now with Russ, and he has a PowerPoint that's going to go over the complex activities at Glasgow.
Glasgow, COP26, what happened? You've heard a lot of people say, well, it was blah, blah, and a lot of talk, but no action. And that's yes and no. First of all, some definitions here. There's a lot of acronyms used when people talk about climate, especially on the international level. So here's a few of the acronyms you'll see. You'll see my slides. COP, IPCC, NDC, which is the National Determined Contributions, and the World Research Institute. So what did they agree to at the official COP26? And COP26 stands for, this is the 26th annual meeting. They agreed to return next year in Sharm el-Sheikh with stronger emission goals, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. 151 countries submitted new NDCs to cut emissions by 2050. They're on a path for 2.5 degree rise, but it's better than the 4 potential degrees rise before these agreements. And then one of the big issues here is the last item, the loss and damage adaptation funding investment. That they've decided to kind of restart and continue and stick money to it, because as with a lot of these issues, they impact the third world countries and those least able to make amends and preparations for it. And here's another interesting thing. They agreed to not double count carbon emissions. There was a mechanism in place where you could trade carbon emissions, international carbon emissions. And in the past, particularly Brazil, they had traded their carbon emissions, but kept them on the balance sheet. So it's like you take the money out, the $100 out of the bank, and you still have the $100 in. It's like win, 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 or not. And then, so they agreed that they would not allow that anymore, but they leave the past credits in place from the Kyoto Protocol. And then another important thing is they agreed to use common timeframes when planning for their NDCs. So they'll use 5-year increments, and they'll use the same ending time. So in the past, apparently, someone had a 10-year or 20-year time frame. So this leads up to a little more transparency, which was part of the plan to make their reports on the emissions and their financial dealings and arrangements and technological features use the same format, so you can compare between countries and you can easily work with the data, and people can see what you're doing too, that you're either meeting your goals or it was not meeting your goals, and hold countries accountable. And then, but really some of the more significant things, I think, my opinion is, occurred outside the formal negotiations. Parties agreed to slash emissions by 30% by 2030, and 141 countries agreed to this land use change provision, which basically means to stop the degradation of forestry and land development. And several countries, 45 countries in particular, agreed to a phase out of coal. And there's a list of some of the countries there. And also several countries, Canada, Germany, Italy, committed to no direct international public support for fossil fuels by the end of next year, which China has already done, by the way, but that was before the start of the COP 26. Another thing is several countries have agreed to end permits for oil and gas exploration and production on their going forward. And so there's a list of some of the countries there. The important ones would be probably Greenland, which could have a lot of oil reserves on there, and of course important from a climate standpoint. And then they also agreed to upgrade their solar investments with an international solar alliance. And then there was also on the side, outside of the formal negotiations, there's a sustainable ocean economy group, and the United States has joined that, and that's reflects their treatment and of the territorial waters, how they're fished, how they're, the actions taken there, so on and so forth. And then what I think one of the most important areas is the non-state actors agreed to at Glasgow 26 was that to go to net zero in this time frame, and 2,000 of the largest international companies have committed to net zero in that time frame, 2030 to 2050. And it's just about every company you can think of, from Burger King to Visa, GM, Apple, BP, Shell, the Saudi state oil company. But this was the important note here, is this was rejected by Exxon and Chevron, basically the US oil companies. And then investment firms, 400 largest private investment firms that hold $130 trillion in assets have committed to aligning their portfolio with net zero by 2030. And they've also committed, there are over 45 countries, they've committed to, in new financing, 100 trillion, that's an amazing amount of money. It's more than the GDP of the United States by many times, of financing for renewables to go to net zero over the next 3 decades. So that's a quick run-up of the COP 26.
All right. Well, thank you, Russ. And what I'm going to be talking about is what is happening in Congress.
I think you're muted.
Can everyone hear? Yeah, okay. So the Senate passed the Infrastructure and Investment Bill in August by a 69-30 vote, and the House passed that in November without amendments, 228 to 206, with Congressman Stauber voting against it. it has already been signed into law. The majority of the climate legislation is found in the Build Back Better Act, but I'm going to give you some sense of what is currently planned. Right now, the budget reconciliation framework stands at $1.75 trillion, with $555 billion proposed for climate and clean energy work. This does sound like a lot of money, but the Pentagon has asked for $715 billion for the defense budget for 2022. So if you really put that into perspective and think about it, it's not that huge. So far, as you know, the Senate has not yet passed the Build Back Better Act, but they plan or have planned to vote on it before Christmas. So one thing I just want to note before I give you some sense of how the money has been distributed is recently I heard a talk by Jen McEwen, our state senator, talking about moneyed interests and how important that is. And I would say Joe Manchin is a good example of that as they continue to maneuver on these bills, on the Build Back Better Act. So I'm going to give you a little sense of how the money is being distributed. Right now, for transportation, this is in the Infrastructure Act. 66 billion is put aside for public transit. That's the largest investment in public transit since Amtrak was created. And to give you some sense of this, that's 66 billion. For Minnesota transit systems, they are thinking at least 856 million will be given to Minnesota for that. Another sense of this is 39 billion will go for transit generally, and 4.5 billion is going to go for highways in Minnesota. One of great interest is 7.5 billion has been planned for infrastructure, EV infrastructure. And this is the first time they've ever considered a national network for EV charging stations. Of that 7.5 billion, 68 million is coming to Minnesota for EV charging stations. Another thing to note, $5 billion is planned for clean school buses so that all school districts can buy American-made zero-emission school buses. All of this is wonderful. Airports in the infrastructure bill, 25 billion is set aside for airport upgrades, with 297 million of that coming to Minnesota. And in the Build Back Better Act, there is another additional $11 billion for EV vehicle tax credits, which would be a wonderful thing to be able to have electric vehicles more readily available. Now, right here, I'm afraid people are going to start getting their eyes glazed over, but I'm just going to tell you a few more things that have been in the Infrastructure Act that are already designated. 89.9 billion for housing, which means energy efficiency, electrification, and so on. 65 billion for public housing that includes the same kinds of things, being able to do retrofits for energy efficiency and so on. 12.5 billion for whole home and electric home retrofits, and a lot for energy efficiency tax credits. The Build Back Better Act includes an appropriation for $3,831,000 for the IRS to implement green energy tax provisions, which will be a really good thing. Another thing that's of interest to us is $55 billion will be set aside for clean drinking water. And there's also a lot set aside for the lead service line replacements, which is a lot of that needs to be done all over the US. And of that 15 billion that's planned for that nationally, $680 million are supposed to come to Minnesota for that. There is also a distribution grid modernization. So they are setting aside all kinds of money and planning all kinds of money to make very vast improvements in things. Beth will be talking a little bit about the Nonprofit Energy Efficiency Act when she talks about this, because this has something to do with solar, which is very much included in the Build Back Better Act. What I would say is that the bottom line is we are getting a lot of money in Minnesota. There is a lot of money that's being planned and already has been allocated, but we just have to have a sense of urgency. And in that regard, it would be very helpful if each person on this call contacted Senators Klobuchar and Smith to, first of all, express appreciation for what they've done, and to just underscore the sense of urgency that we all need to have. One last thing I'll say, in today's editorial in the Star Tribune, they talked about the budget surplus in Minnesota and how that should be distributed. And it was extremely disturbing to me that climate change was not even mentioned in that editorial. So we need to connect the dots for everybody. So I will just ask you, please contact Senators Klobuchar and Smith and your state representatives. Our planet is depending on all of us. Thank you.
I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we've done at UUCD before I turn this over to Brett. The fights over this federal legislation have been huge.
Sorry.
And but there's already some really good things for us. One of the good things for UUCD is that Senator Klobuchar actually put this solar for nonprofits provision into the infrastructure bill. So this one has passed, but it hasn't been set up. You know, there are no rules yet or for how to follow this, but it would provide money for churches and other nonprofits, schools to install solar. And we are getting ourselves ready so that we could apply for such a grant if it comes through. And we've gotten ourselves ready by reactivating our solar, our efforts to get a solar array on our roof. We have started this five years ago, and we had several rounds, but with issues with financing primarily, that has kept us from doing it. So this could be a help for us. If the arrays come in around 30 kW, which is somewhere between a quarter and a third of our need, this would be panels on the roof over the sanctuary, the slanted roof, which has an excellent south view. So, and we're getting an updated energy efficiency audit and waiting for that. The Build Back Better bill also would extend the tax credits. Right now, nonprofits are at a disadvantage because we don't get any tax credits because we don't pay taxes, and that can amount to 26% of your cost right up front and then more in depreciation. So they are Build Back Better would allow the people who install the solar to take that credit and lower the cost immediately. So we're hoping that that might happen, and we're going to be working on financing. I'm sure this is going to involve money from our congregation as well, because generally when you get these things, you have to provide a match of some kind. So if you're thinking about good things and good ways to act for climate in a practical level in 2022, think about our roof. Like I, for example, cannot put solar where I live, but this would be a great place for me to invest in solar for all of our benefit. The Climate Action Team also engages in education and advocacy. Maybe you remember in last February, we went through the congregational meeting to get support for the water protectors for Line 3. We often have in the Connect urging to write or contact legislators, as Sally just did. So We are doing practical, we're doing educational like this, and we're doing advocacy. And we would always be delighted to have anybody join us. We do not have our January meetings set yet, but usually it's late in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and you can contact me if you want to take part in that. I'm going to move right on to Brett, who is going to talk a little more about something about Duluth, and then give us a chance for question and answer. If you'll moderate in some time to talk in small breakout groups. So turning it over to Brett.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth. And we're well ahead of schedule here. So I'm actually just going to put a link in the chat to what I'm going to talk about for a little bit. And then we're going to transition to try something that we've been wanting to for a while here with our forums. And that is replicating what we'd like to do in real life when we're meeting again in person and having a small group discussion. So first thing that I'm going to do is just quickly do a little recap, since this is a quick review of a bunch of different levels of how each of us that are climate concerned can take action or be engaged on the level that feels like the best fit for us. In the chat, I put a link to a local climate action plan that ECO3 and the Duluth Climate and Energy Network has put together. And as a reminder, this last spring, we actually had a presentation from Laura Wedge, the Chief Operating Officer of Equilibrium 3, that really walked through this. So I'm only going to give a very brief 2-minute overview. And then after that, if you have more interest and would like to get involved, feel free to check out that link in the chat. But again, this was coordinated by a bunch of wonderful local groups that have come together, all focused on climate and environmental topics, called the Duluth Climate and Energy Network, with ECO3 providing kind of the overall focus and the most staff time to really focus on that. Funding was provided by CERTS. And the process was basically one where, especially given the Imagine Duluth 2035 plan, looking forward towards where we get our energy, there's just a whole bunch of resources, as many of us on the line know, that are available for communities that want to think about energy transition, that want to think about sustainability, that want to think about really how they can be smart with transitioning from greenhouse gas dependencies across each of the different areas in their city. And so we looked at a lot of these resources. We interviewed 20 local experts, and basically there were 4 main buckets that this overall plan divvies up recommendations in. The first one was food and agriculture. So really thinking about how we can develop a local and ecologically sound footprint that encourages us to get as much food as possible from the closest part of our region as possible. It was interesting to me. I didn't know this before we, as a team were doing this. Apparently before World War II, there was a lot of different food production that was going through Duluth that we can return to, from different staple crops to different garden varieties of lettuce even. And so this is just a wonderful area to focus on. And each of us, I know, has a role in our own life in doing that. Second most, well, actually, these aren't really in rank order, but the second of the 4 impactful actions that we reviewed is transportation, thinking about prioritizing street design, putting people first, having public transit friendly roadways, walking, biking, you name it. I know that Duluth is a point of pride in having the first electric bus vehicles in the state of Minnesota, debuted about 3-4 years ago, and now that's being rolled out a lot more wide scale as they're testing those out. We also know Duluth is known for our old housing stack. We heard that from Jason earlier this year, and this is a huge opportunity for the city and our community in really thinking through energy efficiency and retrofits, and looking at this not only from an energy saving standpoint, but a job creator. And I know that's a lot of the work that ECO3 does anyways. So this is another wonderful bucket. And then lastly, energy production, looking at how we actually generate our energy and how that's supplied to our community, and shifting that as much as possible from the traditional fossil fuels to renewable sources. And so with that, just a reminder that those buckets really overview the categories, but then within each of them, there's ways that we in our households can take action. So say you're really passionate about transportation, well, there's a whole host of recommendations then that you can say, oh, I'd like to find out more about electrifying my vehicle, or shifting to alternatives with my transportation setup, or advocating for the city to put more funding into mass transit expansion, you name it. This is broken down specifically for Duluthians. And so it's not just some article about a national topic. It's how you in this community can get involved, get engaged, and take action. So it's a wonderful place all in one spot for you to do your research, find out which actions interest you most, and kind of nudge us along to having a lower carbon lifestyle. So, and not only does it have actions, it has organizations that are working in each of these 4 areas too. So if you're really passionate about, for example, agriculture, you can get involved with the Duluth Community Garden Program or the Duluth Farm to School Program or the Fair Food Access Campaign. Each of these is a wellspring of information. And for me, at least, it's certainly helped me realize how many resources we have that I had no idea about in Duluth. So I do really recommend checking it out for any of these topic areas, and then sharing. There's a great community where you can actually even post what actions you're taking to learn from each other on that. So with that being said, we've reached the first half hour of our forum today. And what the Climate Action Team thought would be a fun activity is to think about, okay, we've just had a fire hose of information, and all of us, in our own lives and research and how we connect to this issue of climate change, I think where it becomes personal and real is how we talk about it with those in our lives. And so if you'll allow me to transition here just for a minute or two, I'm going to set up an activity that we'll do in small group breakout rooms in teams of 3. And that's just going to be for 10 minutes, and then we'll regroup for questions. But the framing that I like thinking about this with is actually a wonderful ongoing study that the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication has put out called the 6 Americas. And what they've done now for about 10 years is essentially done this longitudinal survey with thousands of people throughout the country, and they've identified how people break down into 6 buckets of their climate change concerns, ranging from the alarmed, the far left of the spectrum, all the way to the dismissive on the right side. And over time, they monitor the trends, they monitor how many of these different buckets are growing, shrinking. The long and the short of it is that more and more people are shifting towards the alarmed, concerned, and cautious category. You can see that overall, this totals roughly 3/4 of the American population now at this point as of March 2021. But we all know people in our lives still that are disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. And there's different tactics or different ways that, again, depending on who you look to on this topic, we can engage people depending on where they might be in the spectrum. But to boil it down into one simple 3-word phrase, what I'm going to do to set us up for success in our breakouts is to highlight the work of our favorite climate communicator, as far as Citizens Climate Lobby, the organization I work with for my day job. Catherine Hayhoe recommends these 3 simple steps: bond, connect, inspire. And what she essentially means from each of these is simply for, let's just take an example. For each of them, for bonding, I'm just going to actually put this on pause so that I can see everyone here while we do this. For bonding, it can be as simple as thinking about, what are the values or the passions that a person in your life has. You can think about having a conversation around climate change with your aunt or your niece or whoever it might be. What do you have connection in common? Are you neighbors, parents, pet owners? Do you share concerns about your community, jobs, health? Whatever it is, find that common ground in that bond stage. And then with connect, show why climate matters to that value. You can tell a personal story that's close to your own background and experience. For example, how smoke from distant wildfires this summer in Canada impacted the life of our foster child who has asthma and triggered his need to visit the hospital several times. That's a very personal story for me that was deeply concerning, and obviously had a real world impact due to the drying out and the intensification of wildfire frequency. And then lastly, inspire. Don't leave them on the cliffhanger. Don't dangle them over the edge and then leave them alone. Inspire them to realize that we can take action together to still yield towards the change that we need by demonstrating working solutions. So link real life benefits of the solution that you care about. It could be any of the levels that we've just heard from Russ or Sally or Beth's review or mine, and then bring that back to the shared values that you found. So for example, healthier air means less lung disease, whatever that might be. But this model of bond, connect, inspire works really well for us as Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers. It's a really simple 3-word phrase that you can try out in your own life heading into the holiday season. It often helps disarm and diffuse conversations, even with people that might be disengaged on this topic. And so at this point, what we're going to try doing is really putting this into action. I'm just going to put 10 minutes on the clock. And basically what we'll have is a chance in groups of 3 to try this out.